universities that you can see on the screen here. And obviously, Russell Group universities are some of the more selective, research-intensive universities with perhaps often higher entry requirements. So the advice we give is kind of skewed towards universities that more kind of selective or competitive end. Having said that, I still think the advice we give is relevant when it comes to supporting young people who are progressing to, a wide range of different higher education destinations. So we've got about 45 minutes, and these are the things that I'm going to cover. I'll give you a little bit of background on the UCAS reference changes, and then we'll cover the kind of three main things that you have to include in UCAS references from now on, and they are providing information about the school or college that you work in, dealing with extenuating circumstances that particular applicants may have faced, and also providing additional supportive application information in support of the applicant. So those are the three things that we'll consider. But if we start with a little bit of background, the first thing you might be asking is, why is it that UCAS references are changing? And they're basically changing from now on. So you will have written your last reference on the old system. So students who are currently in year 13, maybe beginning university later this year, they'll have been on the old system. But those in year 12 who are applying for 2024 entry, or perhaps deferred into 2025, and then all future cohorts will be on this new system. Now, the reason UCAS changed it was that they had basically done some consultation. They'd spoke to universities, they'd also spoke to teachers and careers advisors in schools and colleges. And what they'd found was that sometimes referees were providing information in the reference which was not actually being used by the university in terms of making an admissions decision. And some of the information that universities were less likely to use was really kind of just long subjective descriptions about applicants. And some of the problems they identified with those long subjective descriptions was sometimes there can be a kind of inconsistency between one application and the next, and between one referee and the next. And some referees were perhaps being a lot more enthusiastic about the applicants than others, and so it was a bit of a lottery for applicants in terms of how much their referee was selling them, and it didn't seem like a completely level playing field there. And also there was thinking about teachers' workload as well. If you have a situation where referees are providing information to universities which is not actually being used in the admissions process, then obviously there's an opportunity there to reduce workload and save time by streamlining things a bit and making sure that referees are only providing information that universities need in order to make decisions. So it's about just kind of creating a system where universities are getting the information they require, no more and no less. Obviously, you don't want to provide less information than the universities require, because then you might worry that you're disadvantaging the applicants. But if you're providing loads of extra information which universities are not using, then there's the opportunity there, of course, to reduce your workload and make the whole process quicker and simpler. Now, as I mentioned, so in a nutshell, the new reference system will involve you providing responses in 3 structured sections, whereas you'll know that in the past you provided one continuous piece of prose. So that's the main difference. And during this session, we'll work our way through those 3 sections, and I'll explain to you what universities will be looking for. Now, you might be worried that change is actually going to create more work for you, not less. And it is true that when things change, it does take a little bit of time for you to get your head around things. And some of you may be very experienced, and you've been writing UCAS references for many years or decades. And so you may be very familiar with the older system. But we do feel that once the new system is bedded in, and that may take a little bit of time, overall this is going to be less work for schools and colleges, not more. And the nice thing about that is it frees up time for you to spend in other ways. There's the reference writing process is one part of the application journey, but if you can save some time there, then that frees up time that you can use to support students in other stages of the journey. And perhaps the most important stage of the journey for students is actually that process of researching which courses they want to study and researching which universities they want to apply to. So you may have more time for that stage of the journey. Now, in terms of what Advancing Access has been doing, back in March, we did our own short consultation with 10 of our partner Russell Group universities, and we asked them exactly what they were looking for from the new reference format. And we asked them specifically what sorts of responses they were looking for in each of the three reference sections. So the way we've put this advice together for this session is we've pulled everything together. So we've listened to what UCAS is saying, and we've spoken with UCAS about it, and we've listened to what our partner universities are saying, and then we've kind of pulled that all together in one place. And you may have also read guidance from UCAS or attended webinars from UCAS, and we hope that what we're doing in this presentation is kind of complementing the advice that UCAS is giving, and we're not aware of any sort of contradictions between what we're saying and what UCAS is saying. The Russell Group themselves have put out a statement on references, and they did this to offer some clarification, because when this new reference system was announced, some teachers and advisors were concerned that it would mean that they're not providing universities with enough information. And then as a result of that, individual universities start contacting schools and almost saying, well, can you send us a separate reference? We need more information. Can you provide us information separately outside of the UCAS system? But the Russell Group themselves have made it clear that this will not be necessary. All of the Russell Group universities agree that the new system will capture all of the information that they need to make their admissions decisions. Now, in some exceptional cases, it's always possible that a university could contact you and ask for more information, but that has always been the case, and that was the case on the old system, where you may remember cases where every now and then a university contacts you and asks for some clarification on something. So that's still possible, but that will not be happening as a matter of routine. You'll just be writing one reference, and that same reference will support all of the 5 applications that the applicant is making, assuming that they have used all of their 5 choices. Now, I can set the scene here by perhaps reminding you of what the old reference used to look like, or at least what we used to advise here with Advancing Access in terms of how you would structure the old reference. So we used to suggest that you would start by providing information about your school or college, and also at the beginning you would include any contextual or extenuating circumstances about the applicant. Then we recommended that the main bulk of the reference, perhaps 70 to 80% of it, focused on academic information. And often in the classic case of someone doing 3 A-level subjects, you'd maybe take a tour around their 3 different A-level subjects, and perhaps each subject teacher makes some kind of contribution which is pulled in by an overall editor. And then you might finish the reference by providing some extra stuff like information about extracurricular activities, work experience they've been doing, maybe saying something about the applicant as a person in terms of their character and their personality. Now, in terms of what's staying and what's going, that bit at the start is actually becoming more prominent. So we always recommended including information about the school or college. That will now have its own section. Extenuating circumstances will also have its own section as well. So that also becomes a little bit more prominent. The main bulk of the reference, which was kind of academic, so things that might have been included there before will perhaps now go in the 3rd section, which is on extra supportive information. But you may include a little bit less academic information than you did before, and you might just focus on the most relevant subjects and the most relevant information. So it may not be necessary for all applicants to include information about all 3 A-level subjects that they're studying, for instance. And you might also provide a little bit of that, less of that extra stuff that you would have included at the end. You don't necessarily need to talk about their personality and their character. Yes, you can talk about extra things that they're doing, but it needs to be stuff that's relevant and kind of related to the academic course that they're applying to, rather than just kind of general extra activities that are less relevant. There are some principles from the old UCAS reference which will remain unchanged. It will still be the case that applicants can be provided with a copy of their reference if they request it from UCAS. Many schools and colleges share their references with students anyway, and that's absolutely fine. The character limit for the reference will stay the same, which is 4,000 characters, and it will be up to you in terms of how you distribute those 4,000 characters across the 3 sections, and you can do that in any way that you choose. But 4,000 characters is certainly not a target, and we would probably expect that the majority of references would probably come comfortably under the 4,000 character limit, but maybe in a small number of cases you will go right up to that limit. You can still start writing the reference as soon as the applicant has registered with UCAS. So in principle, you could be starting to write some references now for 2024 entry, although you won't be able to submit applications until September. We would still recommend that you save copies of your references. You can write them in Word and then paste them into the system. And that means you can then just click save yourself in Word and keep your own copy of the references. That can be useful because the applicant might come back to you at some point in the future looking for another reference for some reason. But you always want to save those references securely because they might contain sensitive personal information, and you don't need to keep them forever. So you can think about some kind of schedule for eventually deleting references when you know that you're no longer going to need them. And you'll still be able to see the applications that you're supporting in the UCAS portal. So it's good to take a look at those so that you can make sure that your reference corresponds nicely with the application that's being submitted. Now, these are, in case you're wondering, the three sections of the new reference. So the first section will be enter a general statement about your school or college, and we'll look at that first. Section 2 is going to be, if applicable, enter any information about extenuating circumstances which may have impacted the applicant's education and achievement. And if applicable is the kind of the key term there. So you won't be completing that for every applicant, only certain applicants. And then section 3, which is maybe the kind of the one where there's the most potential for confusion, so we'll look at that as well, is any additional supportive application, which needs to be specific to the applicant and relevant to the course being applied for. So I think relevant to the course being applied for is crucial there. Is not necessarily a place just to put everything else that you would have put otherwise in the old system. It's supportive information that is relevant for the course that's being applied for. There are different roles in the reference writing process. So in an ideal world, a student will have decided exactly which course they want to apply, what courses they want to apply for. They'll have written the personal statement, and then the referee can look at all of that and then make sure that their reference corresponds well to the application. Senior leaders may take on the responsibility of agreeing a particular statement about the school or college. And the good news is that you can use exactly the same statement about the school or college in every single application. And you can even automate this. So there's a button that you press and the same statement just kind of pops up in every single reference. But it may be that senior leaders or head of sixth form or something like that are the ones who have the responsibility for constructing that statement that appears in each reference. Subject teachers may provide an input, although perhaps slightly less than they did in the past. And it may not necessarily be appropriate to get contributions from every single subject teacher, although sometimes it will be. It will all depend. And it may be that a form tutor is the person who takes on the role of pulling it all together in terms of populating section 2, where they're pulling in any extenuating circumstances, and then pulling all the supportive information together into section 3 of the reference. Now, I've got a very quick activity for you, which I'm going to paste into the chat. So hopefully this works for you. And I'm going to, as part of this activity, you should see 6 different statements. And I want you to think very quickly about whether they would fit into section 1, section 2, or section 3 of the reference. So in a minute, I'll go back to the previous slide where you can see a reminder of what the description was for section 1, section 2, and section 3. But if you could just do me a favor and click on that, if someone could give me a thumbs up just to check, just to confirm to me that it has worked and that it is loading up. And all you need to do is, for the different statements, drag and drop them into what you think is the correct column. These are examples we've taken from UCAS, by the way. And then as we go through the rest of the presentation, you'll be able to see and kind of mark your own work, so it doesn't mark it automatically. Thank you. I can see several of you are got your thumbs up, so that does seem to be working. So I'll just give you a few minutes to quickly read these and have a think about which section they would go in. Okay, so thanks for having a go at that, and hopefully you've had a chance there to think about which statement goes in which category. So we'll move on then, and as I say, we'll work now through the three different sections in turn, starting with section 1, which is where you've got the opportunity to provide details about your school or college. So what kinds of details might you include? Well, you can start by setting the scene by just kind of in general terms talking about what type of school is it. So is it a state funded school, or is it an independent school, a school sixth form or an FE college, single sex or co-educational, and so on. You can also give an insight in terms of how big the school is and what the typical class sizes are. So that can be nice to set the scene. It's also really useful for universities to know details of your qualifications policy. So what type of qualifications are you offering? Is it mainly academic qualifications such as A-levels, or are you doing a mixture of academic and vocational qualifications like BTECs, or is it mainly vocational or technical qualifications? In Wales, I understand you take externally accredited AS levels. Most schools in England don't now, but you can mention that. And you can make clear what your kind of overall A-level policy is in terms of whether students would typically do 4 subjects even at A2, or whether they would maybe go down from 4 AS levels typically to 3 at A2 level. You can mention additional qualifications that are available, so it may well be the Welsh Baccalaureate in your case, but you can talk about any other additional things like the EPQ or core maths. It's useful if you can point out if there are any combinations of subjects which are just not possible at your school for some reason. Maybe it just isn't possible to do an A-level in maths and physics at the same time because of the way the timetable works. So you could make that clear. You could also mention how you would arrive at your predicted grades, but I'm guessing the situation for Wales will be, because you're doing those externally accredited AS level exams, they are extremely useful for making very reliable predictions for the UCAS application. You can also comment if there's any qualifications where you don't make predictions for some particular reason, whether you have any entry requirements for students entering the sixth form or the college in the first place. So these are all useful things for you to include. And one of the examples that you tried, which goes in section 1, is this one. So this is explaining how the predictions are arrived at, but that may be a bit more relevant for a school in England which is not doing externally accredited AS levels. Now, there are some things which may apply in certain circumstances, in which case you could mention them if you think they are relevant. So you may work in a school or college where you have a high proportion of pupils who are maybe on free school meals or in receipt of pupil premium. So you could mention that. And obviously that goes in hand with, being a school or college which serves a disadvantaged community. You may have a high proportion of students who have special educational needs or disabilities. There may have been some sort of school or college level extenuating circumstances, a big problem like a fire or a flood. You may have had challenges with staff shortages, especially in certain subjects, that you've struggled to recruit staff in certain subjects have had to be taught by someone who's not a specialist in that area. Perhaps you have a low Ofsted rating, a below average attainment level, or maybe there's just a small proportion of students who progress to university in general, or to Russell Group universities, or to Oxbridge. So that could be something that you could mention. And this is an example from the ones that you've tried. So in this case, the school has mentioned that they're in the 10% of most deprived areas, and they talk about the polar quintile score. So polar, in case you're unfamiliar with it, is this kind of postcode measure where based on postcodes, you're looking at how many people in that area tend to progress to university, and that applies UK wide. So there's all the postcodes in Wales are classified too, as well as in other parts of the country. I won't give you this little video about finding statistics on the gov.uk website because I believe that applies to England only. So on that website, you can look up statistics about schools. I don't believe it applies to Wales, though, so apologies about that. But something you certainly can use in Wales is the tool on our website. So, and I think that link will work actually if you click through to it. So on our website, we've got a kind of module, a training module on writing effective UCAS references. And as part of that, we've got a tool which you can use to construct a statement about your school or college. And all it does is it asks you certain questions and you can provide an answer, and then you click to kind of download a summary of your answers, and then you can use that to construct a statement that you can use about your school or college. And as I mentioned before, once you've got the statements, the same statement can be used every time. Now, you don't have to use the same statement every time. You are allowed, in principle, to submit a different statement for different applicants. But universities won't be expecting you to do that. They'll fully expect the same statement coming through every time. There will be some members of staff in your centre who have access to the kind of admin section of the UCAS website, and they can use the centre management tools to add in a template which can automatically be pulled through every time. And it looks a little bit like this. So if you log into the admin section of the UCAS portal, you'll see a button that says reference template, and you can paste in your own reference template and save it. And that then means that when an individual referee goes on, there'll be a button that they can press just to pull the reference template through. And you'll be able to see once that goes in how many characters you've used so far. So you'll then be able to see how many characters you would have left out of your 4,000. As a rough, very approximate rule of thumb, I would say approximately you're looking at about 1,000 characters for the statement about your school or college. What are Russell Group universities looking for from these statements? Well, when we did our little consultation with 10 different universities, we found these were the top 3 things they were interested in, though this is certainly not to say these are the only things that you need to include. But they suggested some of the most important things were kind of a big problem at the school, like a fire or a flood or something like that, restrictions on particular combinations of qualifications, which might be unusual, and whether the school catchment area is within a socio-economically deprived neighbourhood. So those were the top 3 things of interest when we spoke to our different university partners. Sorry, Sean, I can see I've already been guilty of using an English term, which is Ofsted, and there's obviously a Welsh equivalent, which I won't try to pronounce because I'm sure I'll get it wrong. But yeah, I can see there's an equivalent there. Right, section 2 then is on extenuating circumstances. Now, as I said, this is extenuating circumstances if they are applicable. You probably find that for most applicants, they don't have any extenuating circumstances, in which case there's simply a box to tick to say that you're not declaring any extenuating circumstances, and so UCAS will then expect the box to be blank, and that's absolutely fine. And you don't need to be sitting there racking your brain to think of something for every applicant. And applicants won't be disadvantaged in any way if they just so happen not to have any extenuating circumstances. But some applicants will have extenuating circumstances, and it's important that they are mentioned. Now, we can't give you an exhaustive list, obviously, but these are some of the things that might be included. So it could include things like a disability or special educational need, illness, bereavement, caring responsibilities. As I mentioned earlier, maybe having issues with teachers, so maybe a very high number of teachers within a short space of time, and that has caused disruption. Maybe students are looked after in local authority care, or they're refugees or asylum seekers. Maybe you have students who don't have access to the necessary technology to study effectively at home. That became quite a big issue during the COVID pandemic for some students. Or there could be something else about the home environment. Maybe there just isn't much space or a suitable environment at home for students to study in. Maybe they're living in very crowded accommodation, for example. Maybe an individual has faced a limited choice of qualifications or subjects for some particular reason, or any other adverse circumstance. And as I say, we couldn't provide an exhaustive list because there's so many different things which could potentially happen. And one example that you will have got when you tried was this case of Jordan, who has been diagnosed with Best disease, and this has led to a visual impairment. So this is obviously an example of a disability. And there was another example of Katrin, who has been affected by staffing challenges such that she's had 2 new teachers just within the space of 3 months. So that has been brought up as well. Another thing that you might comment on in section 2 is if there are any issues, anything unusual around the student's attainment trajectory. And then the classic case here is maybe an example where a predicted grade is higher than what might be expected considering an actual achieved grade, and maybe at GCSE level, or maybe in the case of a Welsh applicant at AS level. So maybe you've got someone who's doing an A level in maths, and at the AS level they got a grade C, and then they've been predicted a grade A at A level. So there's slight mismatch there. They're going to really have to quite turn it around to jump from a grade C at AS level to a grade A at A2. But maybe, that really is a genuine, accurate prediction, because there was something that happened in year 12 that meant that that grade C was simply not a true reflection of their potential in that subject. So it's absolutely fine to make those kind of predictions, but it might just require a little bit of commentary, a little bit of explanation in terms of what's going on there. So if a university is going to be looking at a prediction on paper and it is going to seem odd for some reason, the reference is a great place for you to provide some context in terms of what's going on there. But you don't need to state predicted grades in the reference, because obviously they're included in a separate part of the application. You can also tell the university about any particular support that you've put in place to enable the student to succeed at school or college. And one of those previous examples did cover that. So in the case of the student with a visual impairment, I think there was some information there, wasn't there, about adjustments that the students had made to address that visual impairment. And that's useful for universities to know about, because they then know that if the student does progress to that particular university, they may also be able to offer those adjustments themselves. That's useful for universities to know. A few general points about section 2 and extenuating circumstances. Whenever anything's included which is a bit more sensitive, it's always a courtesy to seek the consent of the application first. So just a quick private conversation with them to check that they are happy with you including that. You can stress to them that they won't be disadvantaged, and 99% of the time they're always happy with it. And that applies even if the applicant has chosen to mention something in the personal statement themselves. Now, whilst you can flag extenuating circumstances in the reference, it's not the only place that you can flag it. And you can also mention things with exam boards as well. But if you do this, you should specify this. So external AS exams are a good example of where this might happen. Something might have happened around the time of an AS exam, and because of that, you've contacted the exam board to let them know about it. And maybe as a result, the exam board has made kind of an adjustment and taken that into consideration. If the university also makes an adjustment on top of that, there's kind of this risk of what we might call double counting. So if you have raised things with exam boards, you should make this clear when you bring up the extenuating circumstances in the reference. Another issue to consider is the timing of extenuating circumstances. Now, for someone who's starting university in autumn of 2024, you might submit the application this year in autumn of 2023, and something might happen next year in springtime. And you can't change the reference once it's been submitted. So in that case, you want to contact universities and let them know what's happened, and they will sort of add that in as a note on the application. The absolute worst time to let universities know about extenuating circumstances is on results day. That's a very common thing that happens on results day at universities. Students miss out on their grades, they're disappointed, they get on the phone to universities and they say, oh, well, the thing is, this happened and that happened and there were extenuating circumstances. And the university will say, oh, okay, well, did you contact us and tell us about this at the time? And if the answer is no, then it becomes a lot harder to convince the university to take that into consideration. So you want to get in there as soon as you can and make clear to universities what's happening, when it's happening, so that they can add that note onto the application. Finally, despite the fact that there's a whole section on this now, some universities still have their own extenuating circumstances forms to fill in. Two off the top of my head who I know who do this are Exeter and Cambridge. So if you go on their websites, they've got their own extenuating circumstances forms to fill in. So obviously they should be completed and sent off, and then you can add a note on the UCAS bit of the reference saying we've also sent a form in separately as well with further details of these extenuating circumstances. There are certain things that students can flag up themselves in dedicated questions on the UCAS application, and there's a list of different things here. A lot of these are new, so some of these questions were added in for 2023 entry onwards, i.e. the current year 13s, and they have been specifically asked about these things, and they can identify, whether they've got a parent in the armed forces or whether they're a refugee or asylum seeker, and so on. So obviously applicants should be encouraged to identify these things where they apply, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't write about them too. Some of these can also be sort of automatically verified by universities. Then again, the minute I say that, I'm now questioning whether this applies in Wales. I know for England, they've started verifying free school meals data automatically. I'm not 100% sure whether they've managed that for Wales or not yet, though, so don't quote me on that one. I think this moves us on to section 3. So finally, we're on to section 3, which is additional supportive information. And this is your chance to provide any extra relevant information. And the key word is relevant. That should be relevant to the application. It's not necessarily a place to kind of put anything else that you would have put in the past. Now, I think this one, there could be an element of variation depending on the university that the student is applying to. So some universities have said that they will not be using academic information in this section as a basis of making selection decisions. So they've been very upfront about this. Other universities have sent out a slightly different message. So Cambridge, for example, if you look at the statement they've got on their website, they're making clear that they do still expect quite a lot of extra additional supportive academic information in this section, and they're recommending a minimum of 2,000 characters. So if a student is applying to an especially competitive university, then it might require a little bit more detail in this section. Whereas, as I say, some universities have made clear that they won't be using this section to make selection decisions. So there is a slight variation there. But what you might provide in this section is evidence of the applicant's suitability for the course, details of relevant work experience which has been completed. So obviously, if you've got someone who's applying to medicine and they've done some work experience in a hospital or something, obviously that's very relevant. It could be mentioned. If someone has a part-time job at Tesco on a Saturday afternoon, you may not mention that if you don't think it's especially relevant. You could include things about balancing school and college work with other responsibilities, and you will have seen an example of that on the activity earlier. Positions of responsibility, relevant extracurricular activities. Sometimes we distinguish between extracurricular activities and supercurricular activities. And supercurricular activities are things to prioritize because they are things which are extra activities which they're doing, which are directly related to the course they're applying for. So maybe they're applying for a course in computer science, and in their spare time, for fun as a hobby, they've written a simple piece of software or something like that. So that would be super curricular because it's very directly related to what the course that they're applying for. And you could also use this section to verify things that they've mentioned in the personal statement which cannot be verified elsewhere. And you had one example here, which is it concerns that issue of kind of balancing extra activities with their academic study and succeeding in this. So this was a case of Olivia, who is very busy with her hockey, but she still had to balance that alongside what she's doing at school or college. For the academic information that you include, you want to make sure that it's relevant. You may have to make a judgment this time in terms of, if you've got someone who's doing 3 A levels, which subjects do you include, and do you need to include them all? And you may not necessarily need to include them all, although sometimes you may do, especially in supporting applications to some of the most competitive universities. But a good rule of thumb might be to include information about either a subject which is the same as the subject which is being applied for. So if someone's applying to do history at university and they're doing an A-level in history, then of course you're going to write about that. Or you could think about prerequisites. So if someone's applying to do a degree in economics and the university has said that maths A-level is a prerequisite, then maybe you're also going to write about how they're doing in maths. So you could think of it in those terms. We've talked about supercurricular activities and making them a priority. Some of the most competitive universities might also want to know details of students who are near the top of their class, and we'll give more information about that in a moment. You can present information in bullet point style if you prefer, and universities may find that useful in enabling them to quickly access the information that they require. But you might not always include as much information as you included in the old system, and some subject teachers may make a smaller contribution than they did previously. In terms of contextualizing students who are right near the top of the class or doing very well, you can be quite explicit about that. The first statement here is kind of the way not to do it. You may think you're being precise by kind of mentioning their exact performance in terms of how their percentage scores in particular assessments. But the problem with that is the university doesn't know how difficult those tests are, so they've got nothing to benchmark that against. Whereas if you look at the second example here, we're specifying that Alice is in second place out of a class of 19. And we're specifying that, if we look at how well she's doing in her class tests, she tends to be getting the same scores that students who in the past have got and then gone on to get a grade A star. So they're kind of comparing Alice's performance against that of previous cohorts as well. So that would be more useful. And we get an example here that you were given about Harry, who's an outstanding biologist. And we've got some super curricular stuff that he's been involved in here with his biology Olympiad. And we know that he's consistently in the top 5% of the cohorts when he's taking his assessments. Another thing that you might include in section 3, and this can seem a bit counterintuitive because you might think at first that this goes in section 2, but you can cover some barriers that the student may face which don't kind of fall under the category of extenuating circumstances. So this could include things like they can't access a suitable work experience opportunity. Maybe they do want to study medicine and they've tried desperately hard to get a work experience placement, whether it's at a doctor's surgery or a hospital or anywhere else, and they just haven't been able to find one. Well, you can mention that in section 3. Similarly, if there's some factors which might mean that they would struggle to access an interview, and you know they're applying for a course where they're likely to be interviewed, you could mention that. Certain courses have a slightly different application process. So if you're applying for something like engineering, you may have to put together a portfolio of work to show to the university. And if students have faced some kind of difficulty or challenge doing that, again, this could be mentioned in section 3 of the reference. Right, we've got about 5 minutes left, so that hopefully will leave time for questions. So if you have got some, please start typing them. We've got a few more links for you here. Again, you may be able to click on these now, actually, and of course I'll send a copy of these slides. But we've got the interactive CPD module on the website, which is the first link there. And as I said earlier, as part of that, we've got that tool that you can use to help you construct a statement about your school or college for section 1. So if you're the person in your school who has responsibility for that, you may find that useful. We've updated the resources, the kind of PDF resources on our website on this issue as well, so they're available for you to download. If you're not on our mailing list and you found this useful, then please click through to sign up to it. We only send out very occasional emails, and you'll find out about some of our events and conferences. So we do online events, webinars, in-person events as well, which you can find out about. And there's a link there to the guidance that UCAS have put up on their website as well. Right, that brings us to the end. So as I say, please type in any questions if you've got them. I think we've got one already. Sian, shall I start taking these on?
Yeah, please do. Yes. Yeah, take a breath, Paul. Thank you so much. That is incredibly informative. I know that colleagues here this afternoon would have found it very helpful indeed. Yeah, please. I've got a question as well, but let's go to Thea first about UMS score.
Yeah, so Thea asks, would adding the UMS score in the AS exam be beneficial? Yeah, I think that could be beneficial. And obviously the place for that would be section 3, where so one thing that you can do in section 3 is, for applicants who are very high flyers, just make clear how high they are flying. So we saw that example of sort of benchmarking them, that they're in the top 5% of the class. So yeah, in your case, and I guess this is a nice situation you're in Wales, where you do have these nice externally accredited UMS scores, you could mention that. I think in the past, some of the most competitive universities used to kind of ask for that information, but I think that almost ended when people in England stopped doing the AS exams at year 13. So yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't put that in section 3. It would probably be more appropriate for those with very high UMS scores, like I say, to make that point about someone who's at the very top end of the class. If you've got someone with a more average UMS score, there may be less of a need to mention it, I suppose.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks. Hope that's helpful. We've got Nia who's put her hand up. Nia?
Hi. Yeah, you mentioned the selection decision, for example, Cambridge, who suggested 2,000 characters for the academic section. Is there a list of what all universities want, or is it a matter of checking all 5 for each student, which is quite a lot of admin work, really?
Yeah, it's a question we've had a lot. We've had this conversation. In fact, I was speaking with someone on email about this issue earlier this morning from Russell Group HQ, and yeah, so the current position overall is that the messaging is that you might need a little bit more in this section to support applications to some of the very most competitive universities. Cambridge is an example of one university where they're the only one that I've seen so far where they have given a suggestion of a number of characters for section 3, and their suggestion is 2000. But as I say, there are other universities, including some in the Russell Group, who have said specifically that they do not use section 3 as a basis of making admissions decisions. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a list of universities where we're kind of saying for these particular universities, this is the approach, and for these particular universities, this is the approach. So we don't have that. Whether that changes over time, I'm not sure. It's possible, but yeah, that's not where we're at with the moment. I know that is confusing, and I know it's a lot of work to go round loads of different websites and look at the policies, and some of them websites will have more detail than others as well in terms of what they're looking for. But yeah, that's where we are with it at the moment, I'm afraid. And yeah, if you're interested in some of the other character limits like that Cambridge put out, so they also suggested roughly 1,000 for the information about the school, and they suggested 500 for extenuating circumstances, and that leaves you kind of 500 spare as a kind of buffer. But of course, if you had a student who had a lot of extenuating circumstances, then you might, and you want to go put a lot more characters in, and then you're worried that you're not going to have 2,000 characters left for section 3. In that case, it might be useful to contact the individual university and kind of provide details of the extenuating circumstances separately.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much. Is that okay, Nia?
Yeah, great. It would be useful if there was a list, but
Yeah.
I do appreciate that's
yeah, and I will pass that, because this is kind of a constant dialogue, I think, between schools and universities and UCAS. So I'm always kind of giving this feedback to universities and to UCAS and things about the experience of teachers and how they find it. And yeah, you're not the first person who's flagged that issue. So yeah, we can provide that feedback.
Yeah, I presume that's something that will probably grow organically, won't it, Paul, as this process continues and start to gather the knowledge and the intelligence. We've got another question in the chat. Can you see it, Paul, about a student has no extenuating?
Yeah, so the 4,000 characters, Louise, is absolutely not a target. And I think, on the old system, a lot of references will have gone up to and quite close to that 4,000 character limit. But you're quite right. If a student has no extenuating circumstances and is not applying to a highly competitive university, then you may be quite comfortably below the 4,000. If you're going for about 1,000 for the first section as a rule of thumb, for some applicants you may be literally 0 in section 2, and even Cambridge are not saying that you have to put 3,000 in section 3, so there will be many applications where you don't go to that 4,000 character limit. That's absolutely fine. Something that UCAS will be able to do in quite a precise way is, after the first cycle of this, so after the 2024 entry cycle, they will be able to calculate an exact average of the average reference is coming in at 2,300 characters or whatever. So it's possible that they could adjust the limit in future. If they see that hardly any applications are going in at 4,000, it's possible that they could reduce that. I guess it's possible in theory they could increase it. I don't think they will, because I think 4,000 characters will be enough. But you should expect that for many applications you will be quite comfortably below the 4,000. And then Sarah, to follow on for that, could an applicant be applying with only section 1 completed and their personal statement? Probably not. And I think this is one way in which the advice from UCAS seems to have shifted over time. When UCAS first launched this new system and were first giving the guidance, they were sort of suggesting that section 3 might be optional. But the advice on that seems to have shifted a little bit more along the lines of, you probably are going to be saying something about every applicant in section 3. The amount that you provide might vary from one applicant to the next in terms of what course they're applying for and which universities they're applying for, but you typically will have something to say in support of applications in section 3. But it certainly you won't need to complete section 2 every time, and the amount of detail that you might provide in section 3 could vary from one application to the next.
Thanks, Paul. Is that okay, Sarah?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Could I just jump in with a quick question, colleagues? just before anybody else has any other questions. Paul, on slide 26, you spoke about relevant factors around the school context. It's the slide that starts off with school level extenuating circumstances, e.g. a fire, flood. The second bullet point says any restrictions on particular qualification choices or combinations. Not all, but many schools in Wales collaborate with other sixth forms, and there might be groups of, 4 or more sixth forms or sixth forms and colleges working together to deliver a breadth of provision. And in some respects, that could potentially be something to talk about, because, these are young people who have to travel to other schools, they are working in a different environment, they may have varying access levels to colleagues and teaching staff. So would you recommend making that, giving that a mention or a feature if it's relevant in this situation?
Yeah, no, I think that'll be a good one to include. Yeah. So I guess is the point there almost that there may be cases where in principle it's possible to do a certain qualification, but in practice to do it, a student is going to have to be quite mobile because they're going to have to be able to get to a different provider to do that qualification. Is that kind of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
they've made the decision to go and study in a different environment,
Yeah.
rather than potentially, impacting upon that decision, they stay in their own school and that changes the course of what they choose. So I think I personally think it's worth recognizing that they have, taken on that challenge of going to study in a different environment.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Right, I don't know if anybody else has got any other questions. Yes. Nia has said, I guess that could go in section 2. Yeah. Paul, you would agree with that?
Yeah, so like restrictions on the qualification someone could do, like could apply at the school level or at the individual level. So yeah, I guess it's a judgment in terms of working out whether something is school level or individual level. I mean, I guess what you're talking about there, Sian, where there's a kind of collaboration across different providers. So we'll teach this thing, you'll teach this thing. I mean, yeah, I guess could there be a situation where an individual is restricted because, they don't have access to the bus travel to get there, and they can't drive, and parents can't give them a lift there, and it's too far for them to go? Is that kind of something you would see as an individual level restriction that can apply?
It could be, but I was thinking more of, schools go to great lengths to work in collaboration to ensure that there is a breadth of provision, and young people who may not be able to study, for example, further maths in that school, but they can study further maths in one of the partner schools. So, but it's not a sort of a natural reaction for young people to go to a different environment to study, is what I'm trying to say. So you could potentially see that as one of the challenges, or that they've had to overcome, as part of the process. So that was, as I said, reference to slide number 26. I was thinking that it might feature there as well as feature as part of, the extenuating circumstances. Alfred, sorry.
Yeah, I'd just like to fully support what you've said, that I know in Gwynedd and Anglesey we have extensive partnership working between schools and between schools and the FE colleges to provide a breadth of curriculum offer at 16 plus, and I'm aware it's the same in quite a few of the other rural areas in Wales.
Thanks, Alvid. I think, Paul, what you're saying is definitely, depending on the context, it's worth it being a feature if it's applicable.
Yeah.
Right, I'm just going to stop the recording there. I don't know if anybody else has got any last minute